Okay, sorry about the interruption there. As I was saying, the ideals of the Age of Reason in many ways are going to be extended into this period that we call the Enlightenment, a time period that's going to be characterized, even to a greater extent than the Age of Reason, by a reliance on logic, rational thought, and secularism. We're going to find that during this time, Western society is going to be increasingly moving into a mindset in which a more empirical worldview is becoming the dominant worldview. We started this with the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment is going to expand on that idea to an even greater extent, and it's going to begin to affect the way societies as a whole are put together. We're going to find that during the Enlightenment, as spiritually based views of the world begin to break down, that increasingly questions about things like the divine right of kings are beginning to come up. Prior to this time, most of Europe has been governed by monarchies, with most monarchs claiming divinely granted authority to have the power to rule and to make laws and to otherwise run their nations as they see fit. But we're going to find more and more monarchies are going to begin to embrace input from outside. Increasingly, a more secular worldview in which the divine right of kings is not the defining factor in who gets to rule is giving way to an idea of a constitutional monarchy, a form of government in which the monarch governs not because God said they can, but with the consent of the people being governed. You might all be aware of certain Enlightenment philosophers such as David Hume and John Locke, who advocated ideals relating to the idea of government by consent, the idea that ordinary people can and should have a say in the direction of their own affairs. You'll find that more and more monarchs have parliaments that are helping to govern the nation, that in a lot of cases, the authority of the monarch is sharply limited by what the parliament or the assembly or whatever other legislative body has been put together decides they can or cannot do. We're slowly moving towards an ideal of democracy, although this is going to be a long time in coming, and is really going to see its culmination at the end of the Enlightenment with both the French and American revolutions. We're going to find the Enlightenment is a time period that is governed by increasingly secular views in society as a whole. Religion is still an important part of everyday life. The church is still a significant power, but more and more, people are realizing that they don't necessarily need to turn to the church for all of the answers. There's a growing sense that ordinary people have power over their own affairs and that their lives matter, the humanism that we see during the Renaissance. The Enlightenment is going to be characterized by the strengthening of the nation states that we saw beginning during the Renaissance as well as a primary form of governments. We're going to find in particular a lot of the nation states of Europe are getting very strong and wealthy, in large part as a result of colonial enterprises in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. And strong central governments are beginning to develop and build the international system that is going to slowly become the norm for the world that we know. Now, as the rights of the common man expand, as the power of the church and the monarchs decline, we're going to find there's a hunger for a new way of looking at the world. Science is at one and the same time both going to be a source of a lot of these changes and an answer to a lot of these changes. The beginnings of the Enlightenment worldview, in a lot of ways, are made possible by challenging spiritual authority, and that can't be meaningfully done unless you have the idea that there are secular rules or material rules that can be followed. In other words, that church and God do not dictate every part of life. The philosopher John Locke is going to talk about the notion of so-called natural rights, the idea that there are certain rights inherent to the condition of being a living, intelligent creature. You might recognize these from our Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and although Thomas Jefferson called it the pursuit of happiness, Locke talked about the right to property. And these ideals begin from fundamentally a materialist worldview that science is putting forward. The idea that rights exist outside of human beings being granted them by God, that rights are inherent to us, and therefore that only we can decide who we want to govern us, whether that's governing power be a church, a king, or whatever. Now, we're veering a little bit off topic here, because in this increasingly secularized world, this world in which ordinary people have more and more rights, in which governments are listening to their citizens more, we're also finding that there's a desire for someplace better to turn, someplace that can fit in with this increasingly materialistic worldview. And science, which in many ways got the ball rolling here, is going to become something that is more and more accepted by a larger and larger percentage of the people. There's going to be a hunger for knowledge by which we can explain the affairs of nature without recourse to spiritual or scriptural reasons why things are and why they work. So little by little, scientific thought is going to become more and more pervasive, at least in the intelligentsia. The average person, as with every period of history that we've discussed, is not terribly well educated about the affairs of natural philosophers and the work that they're doing. But more and more, even ordinary people are coming to the realization that there are laws of nature, inherent principles built into reality that do not need a spiritual power governing them. And in a lot of ways, the science of the Enlightenment is going to be all about discovering those principles, trying to understand and lay down basic laws of nature that govern the conduct of everything else. Now, you can't talk about all this without talking for a minute about the spirituality here, because as you've seen up till this point in time, the overwhelming majority of scientists have been men of faith. They have been individuals who believed in God, who believed in the spiritual influences on the affairs of the world, who accepted the notion of divine creation. Quite frankly, there hasn't been a lot of alternative. But beginning during the Enlightenment, we're going to see a different kind of worldview coming up. We're going to start seeing more and more philosophers beginning to embrace views of spirituality that are certainly allowing more room for the laws of nature. The most extreme example here, obviously, is going to be the growth of open professions of atheism. You saw last week that Margaret Cavendish was one of the first publicly proclaimed atheists, acknowledging a world entirely governed by material affairs and by laws of nature, with no gods, no souls, and no spiritual influences at all. In a lot of ways, the Enlightenment is going to become the period in which atheism becomes a practical worldview, for the simple reason that science, for the first time, is offering an alternative. There's a text written by the French philosopher Paul-Henri Thiry, who in 1770 publishes the book Les Systèmes de la Nature, in which he denies the existence of God. He denies all forms of a priori arguments, all forms of teleological thinking, and says that we have a world governed strictly by matter and natural laws, as opposed to by spirits or souls. Now, atheism is admittedly a rare perspective even during the Enlightenment. It's a somewhat extreme view to take in a time period when the church is still a significant power in day-to-day life. And while people aren't really being burned at the stake for atheism, it's certainly not a popular view to take in heavily Catholic nations, and not much more popular in Protestant ones either. So you're going to find that relatively few scientists are adopting an atheist perspective. Most scientists, like most people, are going to be accepting that there are divine forces in the universe. Now, atheism is made possible by science, because now we have the idea that we don't need spiritual rules or scriptures to explain the nature and existence of the world that we live in. But again, it remains a minority view. I would argue it's still a minority view, even among scientists today. But that said, people who are doing serious science, who are endeavoring to explain the laws of nature in terms that are empirically demonstrable, have their work cut out for them, because they have to somehow square that with spirituality if they're not adopting a purely atheistic perspective. And we're going to find that a few other philosophical views are going to come up during the Enlightenment that are going to be both informed by and adopted by a great many scientific thinkers. One that you might already be familiar with is a notion known as deism. Deism is the idea that the laws of nature are set by God, that the divine exists, that God created the universe, set it in motion, and pretty much left it to its own devices. This is an idea that sometimes is explained as God being a clockmaker or a watchmaker. building the machinery, setting it up, and then leaving it to tick by itself. The deist worldview acknowledges the existence of the divine and allows for the possibility of an immortal soul and so forth, but it also allows for the laws of nature to be the only major source governing everyday affairs. In the deist perspective, there are no supernatural miracles taking place. There's no point in prayer because God isn't listening. God went somewhere else to go bowling or whatever God does after setting the laws of nature in motion. Deism therefore offers a sort of comfortable middle ground for people who want to govern the universe strictly in scientific terms, but also want to acknowledge the existence of God or an immortal soul. A lot of scientists, openly or tacitly, are going to adopt a deist perspective. Indeed, many of the philosophers of the Enlightenment are going to be looking at the world through a deist worldview. Indeed, a great many philosophers across all walks of life are. You've probably all heard that the American Revolution was an affair of intellectuals, people who had read the works of philosophers like John Locke and David Hume. And a lot of those guys were deists. Indeed, the majority of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence and the majority of the framers of the Constitution, including such luminaries as Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and a lot of the other great thinkers of the early American government, were deists, and they were looking at nature from that perspective. Anybody who tells you that America was founded as a Christian nation should go back and read their history, because Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence is almost word for word derived from the philosophy of John Locke and his ideas about natural laws. Now, atheism is one way you can go with this. Deism is another way you can go with this. But I would argue the philosophy that is most true to the nature of science is the idea of agnosticism. Now, agnosticism is not a new idea. It's got precursors going all the way back to ancient times, just as atheism does. But the agnostic view is going to be most clearly articulated during the Enlightenment by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, whom some of you might be familiar with. Kant was born in 1724, died in 1804. He's quite famous for a great many works of philosophy, his Critique of Pure Reason being one that you might be familiar with. And among other things, Kant is articulating the agnostic perspective in very clear and direct terms. A lot of people misunderstand agnosticism and characterize it as doubt about the existence of God or uncertainty about the existence of God. And while that can be a component of it, it is not by definition what agnosticism means. The agnostic perspective at its fundamental level is one that states that the true nature of the divine cannot be known on the basis of human experience. You can take that word apart. Agnostic, A for without, Gnosticism, the idea that things are knowable. So the agnostic view is basically saying that you cannot scientifically argue for or against the existence of God due to a lack of available evidence. Agnosticism would advocate the notion that science is fundamentally dealing with that which is testable and demonstrable with empirical evidence, whereas religion is dealing with that which comes from revelation and other very personal and fundamentally non-testable experiences. So Kant is saying that the truly accurate scientific perspective is to say, as to the question of whether there is or is not a God, not I don't know, but I can't know. And basically that the question of spirituality is fundamentally outside the realm of science to test, to prove, or to disprove. Speaking as a scientist myself, I would argue the agnostic perspective is the most philosophically honest perspective to take in looking at how science views the world, inasmuch as the conduct of science is governed by that which can be tested versus that which cannot be tested. And fundamentally, we cannot test the existence or non-existence of the divine. So agnosticism is also a viewpoint we're going to see coming up during the Enlightenment, and it's one that a lot of scientists, again, tacitly or openly, are going to adopt as their way of reconciling having a spirituality with still nonetheless maintaining science and the laws of nature as their primary worldview. Incidentally, Immanuel Kant, though he's not often noted for this, did some scientific work of his own. He was not just a philosopher. He was the first person to conceive the so-called nebular hypothesis, suggesting that the solar system condensed from a cloud of gas and dust that forms into a disc-like shape, driven by gravitational and mathematically demonstrable forces. And he suggests that other nebulae that we see in the night sky, nebulae I guess is the proper plural, are also disks of cosmic dust and matter, the proto-matter that is the basis of the material for stars and planets. He also is going to talk about the notion of deep space and deep time, the idea that cosmic forces are going to slowly and gradually form the universe from this raw protoplasmic stuff over long, long stretches of time, although Kant does not offer an exact time frame on how long those stretches of time are. So, against this backdrop, looking at things from a perspective of trying to govern nature strictly in material terms, to understand and define nature in terms that don't require divine or spiritual intervention, Enlightenment science, in many ways, is going to be typified by the search for natural law, trying to establish basic fundamental laws and rules consistent across time and location that govern the natural world and that we can use to meaningfully predict what is going to happen within it. Arguably the most important of these, some of the foundational principles of all branches of science, are the basic laws of physics. And so this lesson, really, more than anything else, is going to be about the establishment of the modern laws of physics. Now, this story comes to its culmination, you might say, a little bit further down the line from what you're doing right now, when a fellow by the name of Sir Isaac Newton publishes a book called Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, often just called the Principia for shorts. The Principia Mathematica is the foundational text of modern physics, and in a lot of ways, the foundational text of all science that comes after. It's one of the single most important scientific texts to ever be published, because it is establishing a notion of universal, mathematically consistent physical laws. Now, as with pretty much every big shake-up in science, the Newtonian Revolution, that's an important term, by the way. We often talk about there being three great revolutions in science. You've already seen the Copernican Revolution. Now we are moving into the Newtonian Revolution. In a couple weeks, we'll hit the Darwinian Revolution. But the Newtonian Revolution, this idea of discovering fundamental physical laws of nature, is not going to begin with Isaac Newton. It's not even going to end with Isaac Newton. And it's going to be a story that's going to be built by a lot of people making contributions throughout a considerable period of time. You've already met some of them, because many of the contributors to the Newtonian Revolution were pre-Enlightenment thinkers. People like Galileo, establishing basic physical principles like velocity and acceleration and the first simple equations for those things. People like Johannes Kepler, attempting to apply mathematics to model planetary motion and creeping around the edges of a gravitational hypothesis as he does so. These people are laying the foundations that Isaac Newton and his contemporaries are going to build upon. But today, I want to tell you the story of the Newtonian Revolution proper, the story of Isaac Newton and the people moving in his sphere who together are collectively beginning to establish a set of consistent physical laws. This is a story not only about physics, however. It's also a story about the way we do science. As we said last week when we were talking about the idea of, the scientific society as a fundamental unit for doing science, groups of scholars coming together to exchange ideas about nature and learn from one another. One of the things that's going to come with this is going to be collaboration. A lot of people are going to be aware of the common problems in their fields and working on them at the same time. Newton is hardly the only scholar in his day working on principles of inertia or gravitation. And in fact, most of the folks doing this work know each other and are in fact exchanging ideas with one another in letters, in publications, and in the halls of scientific societies. But this is also a story in a lot of ways of what happens when that system begins to lead to interpersonal conflict. The Newtonian Revolution is going to be characterized by an awful lot of scheming, backbiting, and outright plagiarism. Isaac Newton is one of the great heroes of science, but I named this lecture The Tyranny of Isaac Newton for a reason, because he is also going to be, in many ways, an extremely ruthless scholar, one who's demonstrating the problems that arise from the politics of science, and one who is quite willing to brutally trample down those who are working on the same work as him in order to make sure his vision is the one that comes forward and that his text is the one that you remember. But before we get into demonizing Isaac Newton any further, I want to start building the story of the people who led up to the Newtonian Revolution, the individuals who were contributing to building this science that is going to culminate with the Principia. So let's start across the English Channel. Let's go to the Netherlands and talk about a fellow by the name of Christiaan Huygens. That name is spelled a little bit strangely, Huygens. That's simply how we roll in Dutch. Huygens was born in 1629, died in 1695. He was known throughout his life as a mathematician, an astronomer, and what today we would call a physicist. Came from a privileged background. Huygens was the son of a Dutch statesman and poet. His father was a good friend of René Descartes, and that exposed Huygens to ideas in math and physics from the time he was a young man. He studied law, but he never really had any interest in pursuing the legal profession. From the time that he became aware of mathematics, he was enraptured by it and endeavored to spend his life working on scientific questions, most of which would fall under the headings of what today we call astronomy and physics. Huygens, like several of the scholars we have talked about, and this is a theme that we're going to see a lot throughout the Enlightenment, that Huygens was a physically fragile man. He was sick regularly. He had a chronic cough. It's believed he may have suffered from tuberculosis. And as a result, he didn't move around a lot. He didn't get out a whole lot. He spent most of his life basically bouncing between The Hague in the Netherlands and Paris for meetings of the French Academy of Sciences, but otherwise didn't leave his home a lot, save to socialize and learn from his fellow natural philosophers. Hold on a second.